Thanks, Jan. Good evening, everyone. Today's topic is Syria, but I thought at the end I might just chuck in a few comments about Yemen. Well, I'm going to give you Yemen anyway, because I think there's a real example of fairly brutal political cynicism at its worst, being, descending to a new low as the Saudis and the Emiratis start to attack Hodeidah. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. But just to start, I guess, by noting I've had a fairly long and affectionate connection to Syria. I was living there in the 70s, and we developed lots of friends there. They are, to my mind, among the most hospitable and friendly people you could meet anywhere, which makes what we're seeing now on our screens, etc., all the more bewildering and infuriating. And of course it is politically and historically one of the most fascinating countries you could ever hope to visit, and I think hope is now the operative word. I'm going to try and provide just a little bit of what I think is the context of what's going on at the moment, and to do that you have to go back, I think, into history. Just to get an appreciation of the ferocity of the fighting that's occurring across the country. Part of the Syrian self-image, I think, is that they see themselves as hospitable people who have welcomed refugees fleeing from the Armenians, for example, and all sorts of refugees, and also the home to lots of minority groups, especially the Alawites or the Alawi, who make up the ruling elite in the country at the moment. Now, of course, there is a dark element to this. I mean, just because it's their image doesn't mean that it's accurate. But when they saw themselves in those terms, it was the Sunni who were dominating the country. The same Sunnis who now strike fear into the hearts of Christians and Alawites and other minorities. So if you go back to 1963, when the Baathists overthrew the government of Syria and set up the Baathist regime, you see a system being installed into the country, socialist, secular, very emphatically. But its most controversial element was the way in which it attempted to deal with the challenge posed by the various minorities, the Alawites, the Christians and others. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the Caliphate saw the emergence of Arab nationalism with a spectrum, including very conservative manifestations, normally a strongly Islamic element. The Arab nationalists with the new Syria had to wrestle with the challenge of the non-Muslims in their midst. Under the Ottomans, the non-Muslims had certain guarantees. They were protected. They had a considerable degree of independence, but they were second-class citizens. And it's almost illogical to imagine for a conservative Muslim that a non-Muslim could be your equal because you haven't reached the achievement of becoming a Muslim. Now, the Baathists attempted to resolve this by coming up with the idea that Islam was more than a religion. It is a civilization that can accommodate all sorts of people. You don't have to be a Muslim to be Islamic. That was anathema to the conservatives. And what it's done is to produce continual opposition to the Baathist regime, often extremely violent in its nature. The Baathists quickly were taken over by the Alawi, and so you had these two things, these two currents, if you like, being merged in the eyes of the conservatives. So since then you've had violent clashes, sometimes extremely violent, including, I guess, the culmination of 1982 when the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria waged a campaign of assassination against the regime and knocked off large numbers of regime figures, to the point that Hafiz al-Assad decided that enough was enough, and he sent the army in to eradicate the Muslim Brotherhood in Hama. Half the old city was basically destroyed, and about 22,000 people were killed in the process. From that point on, the relationship has been a matter of life and death. You just simply cannot tolerate the idea of compromise one with the other. So if you then fast forward to 2011 and the events of the Arab revolts, most of us, certainly I did, assumed that the regime would step on any opposition that might emerge, and that would be the end of that. A bit of rough stuff, few deaths, but the situation would continue as normal. Well, of course, we were hopelessly mistaken. And we saw the rise of the people, I think, right across the country, popping up all over the place and demonstrating, usually in peaceful ways. But gradually, or not so gradually, rather quickly, the violent men started to step in and take over the revolt. Now, it was the same as 1982, but there were big changes in the environment that created a slightly different context. One major factor was environmental. We had a 10-year or more drought that had destroyed the economy in large parts of the country and driven rural people to the edges of the city, living in slums all around the major cities. I was in Damascus last in 2010, I think, and I was amazed at the huge numbers of shanties spreading for miles from the centre of town. And these were people who had no jobs, no prospects, nowhere to live, and were relying on handouts from wherever. Another factor was, I think, the introduction of neoliberal economics and its sort of bedmate corruption. Largely the result of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and you saw the disappearance of an alternative. Basically, if you're looking for an economic model, the only one that's left is the so-called free market. And in response to that, Bashar al-Assad, the young man, 2000, coming into power, decided to introduce reforms into the country. And reforms were needed. The place was ossified to a great extent. But it wasn't a sort of sensitive, responsive change. It was the classic sell-off state assets, the telephone companies, etc., all of which wound up in the hands of his family, his cousins, the Makhloufs, or his cronies who are part of the regime. And so what we saw was the gap between the ruler and the ruled widening. And this happened right across the Middle East. It's one of the reasons, I think, behind the broader Arab revolts. Another factor was continued instability in Lebanon. So you had the extraordinary murder of Rafiq al-Hariri, who the Saudis saw as their man in Beirut. And as a result of that, as I see his son now as well, I think, and as a result of that, once the fighting started in Syria, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Qataris started to sponsor groups to go in and join the fighting. And so you had the beginning of the external influence. Another factor, I think, is Turkey. Mr. Erdogan still has images of himself as the new sultan. He offered very sage advice to the young Bashar al-Assad at the beginning of the fighting, which Assad declined to accept. Erdogan responded by saying, righto, we're going to see that you are overthrown. And so we've seen this hostility and his support for various groups. I was just saying earlier that when I was in Istanbul in 2013, I think it was, I encountered some Syrian Christians from Aleppo, and they were busy trading across the line in Aleppo, doing all sorts of deals, going up to Aleppo, to Istanbul, getting their goods and bringing them back. It was starting to become difficult because the Turks had handed over border control to Al-Qaeda. And so this is Erdogan's sort of ethical involvement in the process. We'll be talking more, I think, about the Kurds later. But I think one of the points in all of this as well is that Erdogan has decided that Kurds in Turkey are very, very bad people, but the People's Protection Units are even worse, and that they must be stopped at all cost. And no Kurdish territory can be allowed to go from the Iraqi border across to the ocean. And so he sees himself as having a major involvement in that. To my mind, perhaps the most significant and least forgivable external factor in all of this has been the behaviour of the US and Russia. On one hand, Russia, for a number of reasons, some of which are broadly acceptable, I suppose, has determined that the Alawite, maybe the Assad, but the Alawite regime must not be allowed to fall. And it's been, as we know, been willing to resort to just about any atrocity imaginable to that end. And I think Putin has basically won. He has achieved his goal of preserving the regime and destroying any serious opposition. And he is in control of the peace process, the solution to this through the Sochi process. The poor old UN is sort of bouncing around on the edges, but I think is irrelevant to it all. The other baddie, the US, under Obama as well as Trump, hasn't really displayed, I think, much interest in the war in Syria, except to defeat, in quotes, Islamic State, and huffing and puffing about chemical weapons, but not really doing much about it. Instead, what I think the Americans have tried to do is to make life as uncomfortable as possible for the Russians in Syria, just as they did with Afghanistan. And they've supported rebel groups, including some very nasty groups affiliated to Al-Qaeda, providing them with just enough weaponry to keep the fight going, but not enough for them to make any substantial impact on the outcome. The US continues to demand the removal of Bashar al-Assad, knowing full well that that's a deal breaker, that he's not going to go. But they keep insisting, knowing that this will just keep the process going. So there aren't, I think, too many heroes in all of this, and we're left with the man that certainly the West seems to think is the worst person, well, since Saddam Hussein, since Stalin, I don't know, Bashar al-Assad and his inner circle. Now, I think that this is probably going to be acceptable to the majority of Syrians. They simply want the war to stop. They want to be able to get on with their lives. They can work around the regime. And I think that this is particularly the case with the minorities, especially the Alawites, who, you know, they can imagine what would happen to them if the Sunni were to get into power now. The desire for revenge would be, I think, pretty dramatic. But even the Sunnis, even many Sunnis, I think, would still be willing to tolerate Bashar al-Assad. His father had developed a very interesting relationship with the Sunni, especially in Damascus, where he basically said, look, you blokes keep out of politics, leave us to run it. You can do what you like. You can smuggle your white goods in from Lebanon. You can do whatever you like, and everybody is happy. And they tended to be. I think also, throughout the war, and this tends to get lost in a lot of the reporting, if you imagine a map of Syria and you draw a line from Aleppo down to Damascus, to the west of that line is the majority of the population. And they have always been under Syrian government control. And they have been getting on with their lives. It's been getting increasingly difficult. Something like, I think nearly 70% of the population are living at or below the poverty level. So things are not good, but they are used to the government and have been operating under government control. Now, the refugees, and we'll be talking about refugees later, so I don't want to tread on that territory particularly, but just to make the point.
I'm not talking about it that much.
Okay. Is that the numbers of refugees are extraordinary. They're destroying Lebanon, they're creating huge problems for Jordan. They're pretty significant in proportional terms in Turkey as well. I question whether Bashar wants these people to come back. I'm not talking about the internally displaced people. They will or won't go back to their homes. Certainly there's pressure on them to do so. But the hostility between the government and the refugees is intense and probably impervious to time in many cases. At the end of last month, the government passed Law 10, as it's called, which basically requires the refugees to demonstrate that they own the properties from which they've fled. Now, most refugees don't carry their title deeds, and in fact, many Syrians don't have them. They just pass them down father to son, and so it goes. And they have 30 days to do this. If they don't do it, the properties will be sold. So there's nowhere for these people to go back. There are other factors which might discourage them as well, but I won't go into that now. And a lovely quote from Robert Fisk, the British journalist, who is quoting President Assad as saying, "It's true that Syria has lost the best of its youth and its infrastructure. But on the other hand, it has gained a more healthy and more homogenous society." And you can make of that as you will. Now, I just wanted to finish. I don't know whether I'm way over my time or not, but a little bit on Yemen. Today's media is reporting the beginning of the Saudi Emirati assault on Hodeidah. It is the... You're being very gentle, sir. This is the port through which something like 70% of the country's food, medicines, petroleum products arrives. Now, the Saudis say, oh, they're using it to bring in weapons. Yeah, sure. It is a perfect choke point for them. And I can imagine that this is going to be a very long and bloody exercise in a country that is on its knees anyway. This is a legal operation that they're engaged in. This is an operation that has been approved by the UN Security Council. Now, this is where, to quote Mrs. Whitlam, the law is an ass. The UN Security Council adopted a resolution approving a structure for Yemen with the overthrow of Ali Abdullah Saleh in 2011. The structure was set up by the Saudis to suit the Saudis and to ensure that the Hootie had no particular role in government. The Hootie are not a majority by any means, but they are a significant proportion of the population. The Hootie protested, and eventually they took up arms. And when they did take up arms, it was as if they were pushing an unopened door, because there was very little opposition to them for a very long time. Now, the US has ardently supported the Saudis, who decided that when the Houthis got so far, they had to be stopped. And what we've seen is the most outrageous violations of international law, of human rights violations, with bombings of weddings and funerals, of markets, of schools, you name it. They have attempted to, I think with the support of Western governments and Western media, to portray their actions as an attempt to hold the Iranians back. I think the truth is closer to the fact that the Iranians actually advised the Houthi not to take up arms, and to the extent they've helped the Yemenis, it's been a very opportunistic and very limited process. It's a good way of getting at the Saudis. It's not going to do anything to help the Houthi. So we have this extraordinarily awful conflict, one that I think the Americans could stop with a phone call. The Syrian conflict, much more complicated to stop, but I think the Americans could stop the Yemeni one. But I don't think we're going to see anything on that. And on that point, I think I better stop. Thank you.